Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy, and specifically to talk about the yuanization of Russian trade. And what that means is that Russia is now becoming more dependent on the Chinese yuan with its trading partners than it is on the Russian ruble. And I think this is a really interesting development because at the time of Russia's invasion of Ukraine back in February 2022, President Putin was on a mission to try to establish the ruble as the world's major competitor to the petrodollar. So at that point in time, most international deals were being agreed in US dollars. That was the benchmark currency. And obviously President Putin wasn't happy with that. He wanted the Russian ruble to be the benchmark currency that everybody looked to. But what's happened over the course of the last 2 years or so is that the ruble has actually diminished in terms of its global presence. The West obviously no longer deals in the ruble. It's not doing a lot of trade with Russia. And a lot of other countries that are continuing to trade with Russia no longer want to do the business in rubles. So China and India, which are its two main trading partners, they're buying a huge amount of fossil fuels directly from Russia, don't want to deal in rubles. China only wants to deal in Chinese yuan, and India wanted originally to deal in Indian rupees. Russia soon found that it had a surplus of rupees because it isn't buying a lot of stuff directly in from India, and not many other countries in the world are happy to deal in rupees. So as a result of that, Russia said, we don't want to do any more deals in rupees. In response to that, India said, well, we don't want to do any deals in Russian rubles. And so they're now doing a lot of their trade in Chinese yuan and United Arab Emirates dirhams. So in today's video, we'll have a look at what's been going on with regards to the amount of trade between Russia and China, because that's the primary focus in terms of the yuanization of Russian trade. However, we'll also look at the fact that Russia is now paying other countries in Chinese yuan, and the Chinese yuan is actually becoming more and more important. It's probably got more of a chance of challenging the US dollar as a benchmark currency than Russian ruble has. We'll also take a look at what's happening within the Russian economy itself, because there's a growing increase in the number of loans and deposits that Russian companies are making in Chinese yuan. We'll talk about the potential of shortages of the currency as a result of the fact that Chinese institutions are now worried about being hit with secondary sanctions as a result of dealing with Russia. We'll look at the implications of the yuanization of Russian trade on the Russian economy. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think is likely to happen over the course of the next 3 to 6 months and what the implications of this will be for the Russian economy. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. If you've signed up as a subscriber, and we've got almost 380,000 subscribers now. That is a lot of subscribers. This is getting to be quite a big channel. We've had over 120 million views. That is a mind-bending figure from my point of view. But thank you so much if you've signed up as a subscriber or you watch the videos regularly. Really does help to boost the channel. But also thank you so much to everyone that signed up as a long-term supporter, either through Patreon, where you'll get early access to the videos and be able to watch them advert-free, or YouTube membership, where you'll also get early access, or Buy Me a Coffee membership. That long-term support really does help to keep me motivated, keeps me focused on making as many videos as I can. And if you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks recently, thank you for the time and the effort and the generosity involved in that. Really does mean a lot to me. This chart shows the total value of Russia's exports that are being paid for using Chinese yuan between January 2019 and April 2024. And we've got two different charts here. The black bar charts show the total value of Russia's exports that have been paid for in yuan, and the yellow line shows the total value of Russia's exports directly to China. So if we start off by looking at those exports to China. In January 2019, Russia sold $4.4 billion worth of exports directly to China. Over the course of the following 12 months, there was a gradual increase in the total volume of exports. And by January 2020, just prior to the COVID pandemic kicking in, Russia sold $5.4 billion worth of exports to China. In the first half of 2020, as a result of the COVID pandemic, the volume of exports fell to $3.5 billion. However, from that point onwards, the volume of exports that Russia's been selling to China has been increasing, and by January 2022, the volume of exports was up to 6.6 billion. Now, as I'm sure you'll be aware, Russia commenced its invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, and you can see that in March 22, immediately after the war had started, the volume of exports dropped slightly to 6.4 billion. However, there was a huge surge in the volume of exports from Russia to China during 2022 as a result of the fact that the West had turned its back on Russia, and Russia was desperate to find a trading partner that would be able to take large volumes of oil directly from it. China was happy to remain in a neutral position. It didn't join in the sanctions against Russia. And because Russia was in such a desperate situation, it offered large discounts to China to take those volumes. And as a result of all of those factors, China started to buy huge quantities of oil. And by October 2022, the level of exports from Russia was up to 9.5 billion, which is more than double the volume of exports in January 2019 at the start of this chart. The volume of exports to China started to fall at the end of 2022 and the beginning of 2023 as a result of a combination of the West announcing that it was applying price caps on Russian oil. Anybody that was buying Russian oil had to prove that they'd agreed to pay less than $60 per barrel for crude oil. And this had a negative impact in terms of the volume of trade that Russia was doing with China at that point. And in addition to that, there was also a slowdown in the global economy, which reduced the price of oil around the world and therefore reduced the value of the exports that Russia was selling to China because the price of a barrel of oil was lower than it was 6 months earlier. During 2023, the volume of exports from Russia to China increased again, and by October, the value was up to 10.1 billion. The value dipped down to 9.3 billion in February 2024. However, the most recent figures we have show that the total value of exports from Russia to China is currently $9.8 billion per month. So what this chart shows is that over the past 5.5 years, the value of Russia's exports to China has increased significantly, more than doubled, partly as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which meant that the West turned its back on Russia, and as a result of that, Russia became more dependent on its sales to China. If we now focus in on the black bar charts on this graph, they show the amount that Russia is being paid for its exports in Chinese yuan. So we start off by looking at the situation in January 2019. In that month, Russia received a total of $300 million in payments in yuan. And interestingly, that compared to the level of exports directly to China of 4.2 billion. So that meant that at that point in time, China was making $3.9 billion worth of payments in other currencies, predominantly US dollars and maybe some rubles. If we now jump forward to February 2022, which is when the war in Ukraine started, in that month, Russia received total payments of $400 million in Chinese yuan, and at that time, Russia's exports directly to China had risen to $6.2 billion. So that meant that $5.8 billion worth of those payments were being made in other currencies, predominantly US dollars. Now, if we look at the shape of the chart over the last 2 years or so, during the war in Ukraine, you can see that there has been an enormous increase in the amount of payments that Russia is receiving in Chinese yuan. In December 2022, Russia was paid $7.3 billion in Chinese yuan, and at that point, the total exports to China were $8.8 billion. So 7.3 was being made in yuan, and only 1.5 billion was being made in other currencies. If we jump forward to August 2023, this was a landmark moment because it was the first month that Russia actually received more payments in Chinese yuan than it had exported to China. In that month, it received payments of $10.4 billion worth of yuan, and it only exported $9.5 billion worth of goods directly to China. In the following month, September 23, Russia was paid the equivalent of $12.3 billion worth of Chinese yuan. However, it only exported $9.5 billion worth of goods directly to China. So there was a differential of almost $3 billion. And you can see that that significant differential has been maintained in every single month. And the most recent figures we have for April 24 show that Russia was paid $13.4 billion worth of yuan, but only exported $9.8 billion of goods directly to China. So that represents a difference of $3.6 billion. And what this means is that it's not just China that are making payments to Russia in Chinese yuan. Other countries, such as India, are now using that currency. And this is a major problem for Russia because, firstly, it means that nobody wants to deal in the ruble. The ruble is genuinely becoming a dead currency in terms of international trade. And also because Russia is receiving so much yuan, it's now having to do its international business in yuan as well. So it's buying things and paying for them using yuan. And as a result of that, Russia is now supporting the growth of the Chinese currency as a global currency rather than its own. So it's actually making things worse for the ruble. This chart shows the total amount of loans, deposits and bonds that are being issued in Chinese yuan within Russia, and also the monthly trading volume in yuan. And what this chart indicates is that it's not just international trade where Russia is being impacted by the switch to the yuan. If we start off by looking at the situation for loans being made to companies within Russia, the black section shows that in 2022 the total volume of loans was $12.7 billion. However, in 2023, there was an increase of 300% to $46.1 billion. And the reason why Russian companies want to take loans in Chinese yuan is because they're being paid in yuan. They don't want to run the risk of having some sort of exchange rate difference between the revenue that they're receiving in for the export of their goods and paying for the interest and the repayments on their loans. So it makes sense from a business point of view if you can match your debt profile with your revenue profile. And the fact that a lot of companies in Russia are now being paid solely in Chinese yuan. If all of your exports are going to Chinese companies, then all of your revenue is going to be coming in yuan, and therefore you don't want to run that exchange risk. And this is why there has been a huge increase in the volume of loans. And also when you look at the volume of deposits, in 2022, the amount deposited in Russian banks in Chinese yuan was $34.2 billion. However, in 2023, there was an increase of 100% to $68.7 billion. And once again, this is because the Russian companies are receiving their income, their revenue in Chinese yuan. And because those companies either need to use that yuan to service their debt or they need it for making future payments, they're holding it in that currency rather than converting it into rubles. And if we look at the situation for bonds, in 2022, Russian companies issued bonds denominated in Chinese yuan of $8.3 billion. In 2023, there was an increase of 43% to $11.8 billion. And once again, this is similar to the loan situation. If you're receiving all of your revenue in Chinese yuan, it makes sense to issue your bonds in yuan, and therefore you can make your interest payments, the coupons on those bonds, to all of the bond holders in yuan, and it keeps everything simple, and you don't have any risk of the ruble deteriorating in value or increasing in value and causing you a problem in terms of servicing your debt. And if we look at the monthly trading volume, in 2022, the average volume was 18.8 billion Chinese yuan. However, in 2023, there was a 140% increase to 45 billion. And the reason for that huge increase in trading volume is that many of the companies that are now exporting goods are being paid in Chinese yuan. And also, if you're importing things directly from China, then you'll need yuan to be able to pay for them, because none of the Chinese companies want to deal in rubles. So in order to make those purchases, you have to exchange your rubles into yuan and then give the money over. And what these figures really highlight is that Russia is now becoming more dependent on the Chinese yuan because of its dependency on its trade with China. This chart shows the overnight borrowing rate that Russian financial institutions are having to pay for Chinese yuan compared with the Shanghai interbank offered rate. So basically, if you're short of currency and you need to go into the markets and borrow yuan on a daily basis, this is what the banks have to pay. So we start off by looking at the Shanghai borrowing rate. Back in September 22, that rate was sitting at 1.4%. And over the past couple of years, we've seen a gradual increase in that rate to the current level of 1.7%. But you can see the yellow line is relatively flat. There haven't been wild swings in the Shibor. If we now have a look at the black line, which represents the amount that Russian institutions are having to pay to borrow Chinese yuan, you can see that between September 22 and January 24, it was relatively stable. There were a couple of spikes. At the start of 2023, there was a differential between the two rates of over 5%, and that represented a time when obviously there was a shortage of Chinese yuan in Russia. There was also a spike in April 23 when the differential between the two rates was around 3%, and July 23 when it was around 3.5%. But generally speaking, in that period, the two rates were relatively aligned. However, if we look at what's been happening in 2024, you can see that there's been a great deal of volatility. And the black line, which shows the amount that financial institutions are having to pay to borrow yuan, has gone significantly above the Shibor rate. At the end of January 24, there was a differential of 5.6% between the two rates. At one point in March, there was a differential of 11.4%. And towards the end of June, when there was a liquidity crisis in Russia for Chinese yuan, the differential between the two rates was 25.2%. And since that point, there has been a clear differential between the two rates, and the most recent data shows that it's currently a 5 percentage point difference. And that is absolutely huge when we're talking about overnight borrowing rates. These two rates really should be aligned if there's sufficient liquidity. And what this is telling us is that there is a liquidity crisis in Russia right now with regards to Chinese yuan. And this represents a major problem for Russia because it's becoming more dependent on the yuan, so therefore it needs a large supply. But because the Chinese financial institutions, the banks, are worried about being hit with secondary sanctions, they're now cautious about dealing with Russian entities and releasing large amounts of yuan, and that's causing problems within Russia. And because they're not in control of this currency, it's somebody else's currency, that represents a fundamental flaw in their financial system. As we discussed in a recent video, the Moscow exchange was recently hit by sanctions, meaning that it stopped dealing in euros and dollars. So it's no longer trading in those currencies. And as a result of that, it's now been reported that over 99% of all of the currency being traded is Chinese yuan. And this really highlights just how dependent Russia has become on China's currency. The Central Bank of Russia recently posted a report on financial market risks, which stated that the yuan accounted for virtually the whole volume of exchange forex trading after the imposition of sanctions against the Moscow exchange, and made up 99.6% of all transactions. Average daily forex trading volume on the exchange market fell 32.7% after the imposition of sanctions to 282 billion rubles in the second half of June, from 418 billion in the first half of the month. A portion of the exchange market's liquidity moved from toxic currencies to the yuan, increasing yuan trading volume on the Moscow exchange to record highs on some days, including 509 billion rubles on June the 19th, while the maximum figure before the imposition of sanctions was 446 billion rubles. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think what's going on with regards to the ruble and Russia's use of currency is a really fascinating topic. Over the past 2 years, we have talked a lot about the ruble, and initially following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, President Putin was focused on trying to boost the ruble to be a competitor to the US dollar. So initially, he came out and said that any countries that wanted to continue dealing with Russia had to make their payments in rubles, and he particularly was focusing in on unfriendly countries from the West. So initially, in the period immediately following the invasion, countries like Germany and Italy, who were still buying large quantities of natural gas at that point, had to set up accounts with the Russian central bank, and when they were making payments, the euros would be converted into rubles, and then the payment would be made in rubles. And this initially boosted demand for the ruble. But what we saw in terms of the value of the ruble was that immediately following the invasion, it crashed. It fell down to around 130 against the US dollar. The The Russian central bank then stepped back into the market, started buying rubles, and it bounced back to around 50 to 1 US dollar. And that was actually the strongest that it had traded for the past few years. But over the last couple of years, what we have seen is a rapid deterioration in the ruble. And the reason for that is because nobody wants to deal with it. Because the countries from the West have now stopped buying things from Russia. So even though President Putin put those mechanisms into place, nobody's actually making any payments. So that's not boosting the value. And the two main trading partners, China and India, are refusing to deal in rubles. China only wants to deal in Chinese yuan, and that's boosting its own position on the global economy. And India initially wanted to deal in rupees. Russia said it wasn't happy with that, and so they've now come to an agreement whereby it's a combination of Chinese yuan and United Arab Emirates dirhams. But all of this is obviously bad news from Russia's point of view because its own currency is now in decline. And as we've seen from today's video, it's now becoming more and more dependent on the Chinese yuan. And we saw the table earlier that the amount of payments that it's now receiving for its exports has significantly overtaken the amount of trade that it's doing with China. So what that tells us is that it's not just China who are paying Russia in yuan, it's other countries as well. So effectively what we're seeing here is Russia accepting yuan as an international currency in the same way that a lot of other countries accept the US dollar. So over the past couple of years, we've seen a massive decline in the ruble and a huge increase in the use of the Chinese yuan. And this represents a really big problem from Russia's point of view. It's a yuanization of its trade. And the reason that that's a problem, we touched on towards the end of this video. Firstly, we're seeing a lot of companies in Russia who are now taking out loans in yuan, they're making deposits in yuan, and the level of daily trading on the exchanges in Moscow is increasing rapidly in terms of who wants to deal in yuan. And this is really bad news because firstly, if you've got a lot of your companies who are dealing in somebody else's currency, they're becoming detached in terms of controlling inflation. The way that most central banks deal with inflation is by increasing interest rates. And over the last 12 months, we have seen a rapid increase in inflation in Russia. It's risen from around 3.3% to more than 8%. And at the same time, the Russian central bank has hiked its interest rates from around 7.5% to the current level of 16%. And 16% is a really high rate, but it's not fixing inflation, it's not bringing it back down. And one of the problems that Russia has is that as more and more companies start to move to the yuan, if they're borrowing in yuan and they're making their deposits in yuan and they're being paid in yuan, increasing interest rates has no impact on them because they're not borrowing in rubles. So therefore, increasing from 7.5% to 16% doesn't increase the amount that they're having to pay because they're just paying based on the yuan borrowing rates. And this is a situation that we've seen in countries such as Turkey and Argentina. As more of the population move away from using the home currency towards using other currencies, in their situation, they're using US dollars and the euro. It becomes difficult for the central bank to be able to maintain control of the economy. So that's a big issue that Russia has to deal with. But also in terms of liquidity, we touched on it at the end of the video, Russia is now finding that it hasn't got enough Chinese yuan to go around. And one of the reasons for that is because of the increase in the sanctions, which are now forcing Chinese institutions to double check every single company that they're dealing with in Russia to make sure that they're not on the sanctioned list, and therefore those Chinese financial institutions run the risk of being hit with secondary sanctions themselves. So the overall summary of today's video is that over the last couple of years, since the invasion of Ukraine commenced, Russia has changed its trading partners, it's pivoted, and is now more dependent on China than it's ever been in its history. But the consequence of dealing with China is that China is forcing Russia to do all of its trade in Chinese yuan. So that's weakening the demand for the Russian ruble and increasing demand for the yuan. And the Russian state is now becoming dependent on the yuan. And because of the sanctions that are now being applied against Chinese institutions, Russia is finding itself short of yuan. There is a liquidity crisis. And this could cause major problems in the Russian economy. And in addition to that, the detachment between interest rates and inflation that could arise as a result of the ongoing yuanization will make it difficult for the Russian central bank to keep control of inflation. That means that inflation could continue rising, and over the longer term, that will cause serious problems for the Russian economy. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.